It's a brisk morning in the Pacific Theater during World War II. The distant sounds of artillery fire echo across the ocean as American and Japanese forces brace themselves for another battle. The air is thick with anticipation. Soldiers are stationed, preparing for an assault they know will change the tide of the war. In the midst of this chaos, there is a quiet but palpable sense of fear. Fear that lurks in the hearts of soldiers on both sides, driving them to fight, to survive, and to defeat the other. But there is one striking difference between the American and Japanese forces that would soon be revealed in the most unexpected of ways. On the Japanese side, female officers in their neatly pressed uniforms gather in the military command post. They are seasoned, battle-hardened, and steeped in the strict discipline of the Imperial Army. They had been trained for this moment, standing on the precipice of an empire's hopes and aspirations. Japan had spent years meticulously building its military might, and every move on this day, every decision, could tip the scales. But as they scan the American soldiers on the battlefield, something catches their eye, a striking difference. The Americans, battle-weary but resolute, seem unfazed by the threat of impending conflict. They don't show the same visible tension, the same air of fear that the Japanese officers were so used to seeing. Instead, they smile, at ease, even in the face of their enemies. It is a reaction they hadn't expected, one that sent ripples of confusion through the ranks of the female officers. Smiling in such circumstances was almost unheard of in the Japanese military. It was a sign of confidence, yes, but also of control, and control was the foundation of their discipline. So why were these American soldiers different? What made them stand against the fear that so often consumed them in battle? The answer would soon reveal itself. An answer not found in weapons or battle strategies, but in the contrasting mentalities and training that shaped the two armies. It would be a discovery that would stun not only the Japanese officers, but would reverberate throughout the larger conflict. As the battle intensified, the Americans, in their unwavering composure, showed their true strength, the ability to face adversity with unshaken resolve, to fight with courage and confidence. They weren't just soldiers. They were a reflection of a different world. A world in which the enemy did not control them, a world where they could smile, even in the face of fear. The year is 1943, and the Pacific War is in full swing. The United States is fighting a brutal battle on multiple fronts, with the Japanese Empire expanding its reach across the Pacific. In this theater of war, thousands of miles from the safety of their homelands, both sides are entrenched in a bitter struggle. The events of the day seem endless, each battle shaping the trajectory of the war, altering the fate of nations. But there is one key difference that cannot be ignored: the soldiers' response to fear, to uncertainty, to the very real prospect of death. For the female officers in the Imperial Japanese Army, it was their duty to command, to strategize, and to instill discipline in their subordinates. The psychological weight of this responsibility weighed heavily on their shoulders. These women were not the passive figures often portrayed in wartime narratives. They were strong, dedicated, and remarkably intelligent individuals who had risen through the ranks in a male-dominated military. Despite the extreme nature of the conflict, they adhered to the same expectations as their male counterparts. Fear had no place in their lives. They were trained to suppress any emotions that might show weakness. In fact, fear was not only seen as a weakness but as a failure of resolve. The teachings of Bushido, the samurai code that had shaped Japanese military culture for centuries, emphasized honor, loyalty, and control over one's emotions. The Japanese military was notorious for its strict discipline, and fear was considered the enemy of both strength and honor. The American soldiers they were facing, however, seemed almost impervious to the psychological strain that had long gripped their enemies. To the Japanese officers, the Americans were an enigma. How could they maintain such composure under fire? How could they smile, laugh, and even joke when the world around them was so perilous? As the days wore on, the female officers began to study the behavior of their American counterparts with an increasing sense of unease. The Japanese military had always relied on strict codes of conduct, often relying on the unseen pressures of their disciplined culture to maintain order. But the Americans, despite their different culture, seemed to defy these rules. They faced fear head-on and somehow shrugged it off. How could this be? The difference lay in the contrasting cultures and training of both sides. The Japanese military drilled its soldiers in absolute control, reinforcing the idea that every soldier was an extension of the emperor's will. There was little room for individuality, and emotions like fear were meant to be buried beneath the surface. Honor and death in battle were intertwined. The ultimate form of sacrifice was not to flinch, not to show fear, even in the face of imminent death. The Americans, on the other hand, had a different approach. Their military training was rooted in individualism, resilience, and adaptability. Fear was not something to be conquered through suppression, but rather something to be faced openly and overcome. American soldiers were taught to embrace fear, to acknowledge it, but to push forward nonetheless. They were encouraged to maintain their sense of humor, to keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. This attitude, this ability to smile in the face of adversity, was not born from a place of naivete. It was rooted in a profound belief that they could overcome any obstacle, no matter how daunting. It was a psychological resilience that helped them persevere through some of the most harrowing battles of the war. The smile, therefore, was not a symbol of weakness or bravado, but of mental fortitude. As the war raged on, the female officers began to feel the strain of their own military system. The weight of responsibility, the unyielding discipline, and the pressures of command began to wear on them. They were human, after all, and the realities of war had begun to take their toll. But their training, their culture, and their beliefs held them firm. They could not show weakness. They could not show fear. It was this cultural clash, the American ability to smile in the face of fear versus the Japanese repression of it, that would define so many moments in the Pacific conflict. At the Battle of Midway, when the tide of the war in the Pacific began to turn in favor of the Allies, the Japanese military felt the full weight of their failures. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers, their most formidable ships, was a blow from which they would never recover. This moment, like so many others, was marked by Japanese officers who adhered to the codes of honor and discipline. They could not afford to show fear, to show that they were shaken. And yet, amid their stoicism, they found themselves questioning the true cost of such rigidity. Meanwhile, the American forces, although equally shaken by the devastation, did not retreat into silence or despair. Their ability to adapt, to laugh, and to keep moving forward, even in the darkest moments, gave them an edge. They did not hide their fear, but instead faced it with a smile, a simple yet profound act of defiance against the brutality of war. This cultural divide, between the American resilience and the Japanese suppression, would play a pivotal role throughout the war. It wasn't just about the strategies or the weapons. It was about how each side approached fear, how each side dealt with the tremendous psychological toll that war inflicted on the human spirit. The female officers observing this unique American response would soon come to realize that their smiles, those smiles born from humor, courage, and defiance, were not a weakness. They were a strategy, a way of coping with the unimaginable. In the years that followed, many of these officers would reflect on the differences between the two sides, understanding that it wasn't just about military might or tactics. It was about how soldiers, individuals, and nations alike learned to face their darkest moments. The final stages of the war in the Pacific were defined by brutality, heroism, and strategic maneuvering. As the Allies began to gain ground, Japanese forces, already stretched thin by the ongoing conflict, felt the inevitable collapse of their empire. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945 would be the last major offensive before the war's conclusion. The suffering was immense on both sides, and the consequences of every action became more profound. It was during this final phase of the war that the contrast between the American and Japanese mentalities would come into sharp focus. The American forces had become increasingly adept at not just fighting, but adapting to the ever-changing conditions of the battlefield. The psychological strength of the soldiers, honed over years of grueling combat, played a crucial role. For many, it was a sign of resilience that surpassed anything the Japanese military had anticipated. In the aftermath of battles like Okinawa, there was no immediate celebration on either side. The cost was staggering, tens of thousands dead, wounded, and maimed. The war had taken its toll on the soldiers, and the psychological scars would last long after the final shots were fired. However, for the Americans, the ability to face fear head-on with an unbroken spirit, expressed through that emblematic smile, had proven to be not just a coping mechanism, but a formidable psychological weapon. For the female officers of the Imperial Japanese Army, the final moments of the war were a bittersweet realization. They had been trained to believe in the power of unwavering control, in the stoicism of suppressing all emotions in the face of war. But they began to understand that this very repression had its limits. Where the Americans had learned to acknowledge their fear and move forward, they had created a culture that allowed for emotional release, without it leading to a breakdown in discipline or honor. The Japanese officers, however, remained locked in their cultural and military traditions, unable to fully embrace the emotional aspects of warfare that the Americans had. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 marked the definitive end of the Pacific War. But they also represented the crushing realization for the Japanese leadership that their system, built on secrecy and rigid discipline, had failed them. The inability to adapt, to find the flexibility in their mental fortitude that the Americans had so freely demonstrated, became apparent in their final moments. It was this realization that forever shifted the narrative of World War II, not only in terms of military technology or strategy, but also in the way that psychological strength and emotional resilience could change the course of history. For the female officers who had once stood on the front lines, questioning the strength of their American counterparts' smiles, the end of the war brought not just a defeat of the empire they had fought to protect, but also a deep personal reckoning. They had fought with honor, with resolve, and yet they had faced an enemy who had not just been brave on the battlefield, but who had understood how to survive in the chaos of war in a fundamentally different way. They had smiled, and in that smile, found a strength that transcended physical endurance. It was a psychological strategy that, in its simplicity, had proven to be deeply powerful. As the years passed and World War II became history, the contrast between the American and Japanese military mindsets continued to serve as a lesson in resilience. The American approach, founded on the ability to adapt, to find courage in the face of overwhelming fear, became a model for future military strategies. It emphasized the psychological aspects of war, focusing not just on tactics, but on the human element, the will to keep fighting even when victory seemed out of reach. For Japan, the post-war years brought a need for reflection and reconstruction. The rigid, hierarchical military structure that had once seemed invincible crumbled. The country rebuilt itself, embracing new technologies, new alliances, and new ways of thinking. The lessons learned from their defeat would shape the future of Japan, not just in terms of military strategy, but in terms of its national psyche. Japan's ability to overcome the shame of defeat and reinvent itself would stand as a testament to the power of resilience, even if it came too late to change the outcome of the war. In the years following the war, many former Japanese soldiers and officers would reflect on the smiles of their American counterparts, acknowledging the profound impact that this simple yet powerful display of emotion had on their understanding of fear and resilience. They had seen their enemies' smiles as symbols of something they could never understand, something that the rigid structures of their own training and culture had never taught them. But in the quiet aftermath of the war, these smiles became a lasting reminder of the human capacity for courage, adaptability, and survival. This war, this conflict, was not just a clash of weapons and strategies. It was a clash of ideologies, of cultures, of human spirits. The legacy of that clash remains with us today, not in the weapons used nor in the strategies deployed, but in the quiet lessons learned from the battlefield. The ability to smile in the face of fear, to acknowledge the darkness without allowing it to consume you, is a lesson that transcends the military. It is a lesson that every generation carries forward, one that continues to shape the world in profound ways. As the final shot of this documentary fades, we are left with a powerful image: the American soldier, battered and weary, smiling as he faces the next challenge. His smile is not one of arrogance, but one of survival. It is a smile that speaks of resilience, of hope, and of the ability to face the impossible with unwavering strength.